The last of the endocrine organs that we're going to talk about are the adrenal glands and pancreas. Now, I want to make really clear before I go into this to just let you know other organs in the body secrete hormones, but we're not going to talk about them because they may only secrete one hormone. For example, the kidneys secrete a hormone really important for development of red blood cells. We'll get to that when we learn about the blood. The heart secretes a really important hormone that helps regulate levels of fluid in the blood, and you'll learn about that when we get to the heart. We're only going to focus on the organs that are considered true endocrine organs in that they secrete a number of important hormones that are relevant to our discussion. So don't just think because I haven't mentioned another organ that it doesn't have the capability of secreting a hormone or two, because many other organs in the body do. That being said, let's talk about the adrenal glands first before we get to the pancreas. The adrenal glands are located, you'll remember, superior to the kidneys, and you have one atop each of your kidneys. And the adrenal glands are composed of, remember, a parenchymal region, that's the functional part of the gland, and then there's the stroma, the outer covering, if you will. And if we look at the parenchyma of the adrenal glands, there are two main portions to it. The adrenal cortex, which is kind of the outer portion of the parenchyma, and the adrenal medulla, which is the middle portion of the parenchyma. And these two have different types of tissue from which they're derived. So remember back when I talked about the pituitary gland, and I said it's actually a combination of epithelial tissue in the anterior pituitary and neuronal tissue in the posterior pituitary? Well, we have a very similar setup here. The adrenal medulla is a type of neuronal tissue. And it is, as you remember from our study of the autonomic nervous system, it is connected with the sympathetic nervous system, and it secretes catecholamines. And specifically, it is secreting epinephrine. So the adrenal medulla also can secrete a little bit of norepinephrine, but most of the norepinephrine is secreted by other parts of the sympathetic nervous system. And the epinephrine, 80% of the epinephrine, or 80% of the hormone, I should say, that comes out of the adrenal medulla is epinephrine, and only 20% is norepinephrine. So remember, the two of these together conspire to heighten that fight or flight response that you feel. And so it has a number of impacts. For one thing, epinephrine and norepinephrine encourage a particular process in the body called glycogenolysis. Now, if you take this and split this word apart, you can tell exactly what it does. Lysis means to split, and glycogen refers to those long strings of glucose molecules that are all strung together and stored that way in the liver. Glycogenolysis, therefore, means splitting apart stored molecules of glucose into individual glucose molecules and releasing them into the blood. Makes perfect sense. If you're in a fight or flight response, you want to get sugar molecules into the blood as fast as possible so you can fuel your skeletal muscle, your heart, and your brain during the crisis event. So glycogenolysis principally is an event that occurs in the liver. It can also occur in muscle tissue as well. The other big thing that the epinephrine and norepinephrine encourage is another long word called gluconeogenesis. Now take this word apart and you can figure out what it means too. Genesis means to create. Neo means new. Gluco refers to sugar. So literally, gluconeogenesis means I manufacture sugars, glucose molecules from other sources. Principally, those other sources are lipid molecules. Sometimes they're also amino acids. This is another thing that happens principally in the liver, but the kidneys can also do this. And again, the idea here is manufacture glucose molecules, get them into the blood so we can fuel muscle, heart, and brain during a crisis event. Okay, epinephrine and norepinephrine also help to do things like induce sweating because sweating helps to clear extra heat generated from the increased metabolic activity of your body during a fight or flight. Um, and epinephrine also stimulates the release of glucagon. Glucagon is a hormone we're going to learn about in a minute that's manufactured by the pancreas, and we'll learn about its role shortly. So let's focus real quick on the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex is all of this tissue on the kind of outer portion of the parenchyma, and it is actually glandular tissue. It is epithelial tissue, whereas the adrenal medulla was neuronal tissue. Now, the adrenal cortex has the ability to manufacture a whole bunch of different types of hormones, about 24 or so, in just one category alone. And your book goes into showing you some different zones or regions of the adrenal cortex. We're not going to worry about those different zones. What you need to know about the adrenal cortex is that it makes a number of different classes of hormones, including things called corticoids, also called corticosteroids, means the same thing. It can make some different types of sex hormones in small amounts, not huge amounts, but it can make some small amounts. And it also makes some other hormones, some things like, for example, mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, for example. We'll be learning about the specific function of all those different hormones during class, but I'm going to kind of go over them really briefly on the next slide to just kind of give you a lay of the land. So if we look at the mineralocorticoids that are manufactured by the adrenal cortex, the main one that you have to know is called aldosterone. Now, one thing I want to point out is if you see the word corticoid in a hormone, it means it's derived from cholesterol. Just think of it that way. These all have cholesterol as their starter basis molecule from which we then add and delete different atoms to make all of these different types of hormones. So here's aldosterone down here, and you can see there's that classic cholesterol molecule that is the starter molecule for the creation of aldosterone. The main principal job of aldosterone is to regulate water levels, and it does that by telling the kidneys to retain sodium ions. And where sodium goes, water follows. So if I retain sodium in the blood rather than releasing it in the urine, if that sodium remains in the blood, then water remains in the blood and does not go out of the body in urine. Now the trade-off for this is if I retain sodium, I release potassium ions. It's just a trade-off, one for the other. So the kidneys will preferentially secrete potassium into the urine so that it can retain sodium in the blood. That's the main job of aldosterone. What about the glucocorticoids? Well, there's lots of different glucocorticoids. And these are principally secreted in response to the anterior pituitary releasing a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. And I'll just talk about just one of the glucocorticoids and to give you kind of an idea of how these generally function. They all have similar types of function. Here's cortisol right here, which is manufactured in the body, and it's also called hydrocortisone. There's a man-made version of it, cortisone, that people sometimes take. Prednisone is a very similar molecule, and it does a number of different things. Think of cortisol as a stress hormone. It's released in times of stress, like during fight or flight responses. And so it does a number of things that is very similar to the kinds of activities that norepinephrine and epinephrine did. For one, it stimulates gluconeogenesis, and you'll remember that's to make new sugars from other molecules like lipids or amino acids. It also stimulates glycogenolysis, which in some books, by the way, is also called glycolysis. It means the same thing, to split apart glycogen molecules into individual glucose molecules and release them into the bloodstream. Now, this is all great for elevating sugar levels in the blood during times of crisis. The downside of cortisol is that it tends to linger in the body for a lot longer time than epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if somebody's in a stressful job, for example, their cortisol levels are going to be high, and they're not just going to be high during a particular stressful event, but they'll tend to be high all the time if a person's in a stressful job. The problem with this is gluconeogenesis, that process by which we make new sugar molecules from lipids and amino acids. If I have cortisol levels elevated for a long time, that means I have gluconeogenesis occurring over a long period of time. The bad thing about that is once my lipid stores run out, lipids are our first choice for making sugar. If I run out of lipids, the next place I'm going to go is I'm going to start harvesting amino acids and proteins and breaking those proteins down into amino acids and using those as sources for making glucose molecules. Problem with that is your immune system really depends on having ready access to lots of amino acids so that it can manufacture the tons of different molecules like antibodies, which is a protein, so that it can fight off infections. So people who have heightened levels of cortisol, such as people who are really stressed, over time, their immune system becomes suppressed because the immune system cannot get access to the amino acids it needs to make the proteins it needs to make. All of those amino acids and proteins are getting funneled into this process of gluconeogenesis. So it is true, when people get stressed, they oftentimes get sick because their immune system is being repressed. People who take prednisone medically for, let's say, poison ivy or poison oak are often warned when they begin taking it to be careful about getting themselves around or exposing themselves to people with flu or colds, because while they're on that prednisone, they are going to be their immune system is going to be suppressed, and they're going to be more likely to get sick. Last thing we're going to talk about, last organ in the endocrine system we're going to spend any significant amount of time on, is the pancreas. Pancreas is really important because it is essential for proper regulation of sugar levels in the blood. Now, the pancreas, like the gonads, has the ability to be both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. When we learn about the digestive system, we will learn about the exocrine functions of the pancreas. The exocrine functions of the pancreas include the manufacture of a whole lot of different digestive enzymes that get released into the lumen of the small intestine and then assist in the digestion of the food that we eat. More on that later. For now, we're only going to focus on the endocrine functions of the pancreas. And the hormones that are manufactured in the pancreas are manufactured in little islands of tissue called the islets of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islets. And these are little blobs or regions of endocrine tissue in and amongst all the exocrine tissue that's making all the digestive enzymes. And if we look at one of these islets up close, we can see that there are 3 different types of cells that are found in it. Now, before I talk about the 3 different types of cells found in a pancreatic islet, I just want to make sure everybody's oriented as to where the pancreas is actually found. The stomach is an organ that would be sitting right about here, and behind or dorsal to the stomach is the pancreas. It's a region of glandular tissue. It's easy to find on dissection if you just look for the intersection between the stomach and the small intestine. In other words, where the stomach and the small intestine connect. If you look right at the place where the stomach and small intestine connect, you will see the pancreas located right there, because the pancreas dumps all of its exocrine products, its digestive enzymes, into the upper part of the small intestine to assist with digestion. So let's look at these 3 different types of cells that are found in a pancreatic islet and learn about the 3 types of hormones that are manufactured by these cells. The first type I'm going to talk about are what are called the beta cells. And the beta cells, just by random whatever, got colored blue in this picture in your textbook. They're not really blue, that's just the color they were given in this illustration. So you have smattered throughout this pancreatic islet lots of these beta cells. They manufacture insulin. Insulin, remember, is a peptide hormone. And the job of insulin is to lower blood glucose levels. And it does that by telling cells throughout the body to store that glucose inside of cells. So another way of saying this is that it stimulates the storage of sugar molecules by making, for example, the liver store those sugar molecules in long chains called glycogen. So insulin stimulates glycogenesis. Now take that word apart. Genesis means to create. Glyco refers to glycogen. So we got glycogenesis is the manufacture of glycogen molecules, or a way to store sugar in long branched molecules. It also inhibits glycogenolysis, and you'll remember that's glycogenolysis is the splitting apart of glycogen to release individual glucose molecules in the blood. Insulin also inhibits gluconeogenesis. It inhibits the manufacture of new sugar molecules. That should make sense because if sugar molecules are in abundance in the blood and the insulin is trying to get cells to store glucose inside of cells, the last thing we want to do is go about making new molecules of glucose and putting them into the blood too. Okay, so the job of insulin is to lower blood glucose levels. And it does this via recruiting to the surface of cells a group of molecules called glucose transporter proteins, or GLUTs. And I'm going to talk more about GLUTs during class. Just know that they are associated with insulin secretion for now. The second major class of cells found in a pancreatic islet are the alpha cells. And arbitrarily in this picture, the alpha cells have been colored pink. The alpha cells make glucagon. Glucagon is a hormone that does the exact opposite of insulin. So everything that we talked about up here, make it the opposite, and that tells you what glucagon does. The principal job of glucagon is to raise blood glucose levels, and it does that a number of different ways. For example, it stimulates the liver to start breaking down glycogen molecules and releasing individual glucose molecules into the blood. That's glycogenolysis. And the L should be there, not here. Okay, so it stimulates glycogenolysis. It would also help to stimulate gluconeogenesis, meaning the manufacture of new sugar molecules. So it does everything that's the opposite of insulin. So if you can memorize what insulin does, then just remind yourself, oh yeah, glucagon does the opposite of insulin. You'll be set to go. Now the third type of cell found in a pancreatic islet is called a delta cell. And they are much more scarce. Okay, you have lots of beta cells, you have lots of alpha cells. Number of delta cells you have is a lot smaller. In this picture, the delta cells have been arbitrarily colored orange. Delta cells do not secrete a true hormone. Instead, they manufacture a paracrine. And you'll remember a paracrine is a messenger molecule that only influences neighboring cells. It doesn't go into the blood. It only impacts cells adjacent to it. The paracrine that the delta cells manufacture is a paracrine called somatostatin. It happens to be the exact same molecule as growth hormone inhibiting hormone that's released from the hypothalamus. It's identical in terms of molecular structure. It's just released from a different part of the body, so we give it a different name. It's called somatostatin if it's released from a delta cell in the pancreatic islets. It's called growth hormone inhibiting hormone if it's released into the portal system by the hypothalamus. So what does somatostatin do? Well, its role is really complex. Suffice it to say, for the purposes of our class, all it does is it helps to modulate or regulate the secretions from the beta and alpha cells. So it helps decide when is insulin going to be released and when is glucagon going to be released. It helps to regulate alpha and beta cell activity.